All right, good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining us. Today, what is the second series in what I like to call Jody Talks Politics, we'll be joined by Nick Sherry. I'm sure of some there that out there know Nick very well, but for those that may not know Nick as well as others, Nick first entered the Senate in 1990 as a Labor senator for Tasmania, and very quickly became chair of a Senate Select Committee on superannuation, which was basically at the forefront of the introduction of compulsory superannuation and the system that we know today. Nick also was the first ever Minister for Superannuation in the Rudd-Gillard years, and upon retiring from Parliament in 2012 has pursued a very successful commercial career where he's still very active in discussion and development of in regards to superannuation policy, both domestically and offshore, where through various consulting arrangements and work, Nick has advised governments and regulators around the world, and also currently chairs a $25 billion fund here in Australia. So, Nick, welcome. Let's get right into it. As I said, you entered the Senate in 1990. Very quickly became chair of a dormant committee, as I remember it, the Senate Select Committee on Superannuation, at the specific request as well, which I don't think many would know, of the then Treasurer Paul Keating, and you were just a new senator. So just take us back very briefly to that time over 30 years ago now, and that period of time that led up to the introduction of compulsory superannuation.
Thanks, Jody, and hi to viewers and listeners. That period in 1990, when, as you mentioned, I was personally selected by Paul Keating, the committee had to consider and gain passage through the Senate, which wasn't easy because the Labor government did not have a majority. What's called the Superannuation Guarantee Act, which is the foundation that started at 3% rising to 9% compulsory contributions by 2002, so a 10-year phasing. And we got that legislation through, and the task of the committee was to do that. Months and months of hearings. It was a very controversial proposal from the then Paul Keating government, but we got it through. The second and primary task 2 years later was to ensure the passage and contribute to the design of what's called the Superannuation Industry Supervision Act, which is the foundation regulatory framework of what we know as compulsory superannuation. One quick point, the Super Guarantee Act of 1992 was not the starting point. The starting point was actually back in 1987 with the initial what's called 3% compulsory contribution. Yep. So the system's actually now been in place for some 39 years.
Yeah. Before I get on to the next question, Nick, I should have said also to the audience, please feel free to put questions into the public chat, and obviously Nick will be happy to take questions. Nick, so as you said, it's now been in place for 37 years, and it's basically now like a major, I suppose, foundation stone of our community, like up there with, something like Medicare and universal healthcare. So looking over that period of time, what do you think has been the biggest success of the introduction of compulsory superannuation?
I think two major successes. One is the intent of the policy was fairness, adding to the retirement income of 7 out of 10 Australians who had nothing over and above the basic age pension. 7 out of 10 Australians did not have superannuation. The very fortunate few, mainly public sector and in some private sector, had an add-on, but 7 out of 10 truckies, retail workers, hotel workers had nothing. So they've got something extra. Secondly, the economic impact. It's a vast savings pool. It's now $4.4 trillion. It's the fourth largest pension system in the world. And obviously, because the legal requirement for trustees is to diversify those investments, it helps power the Australian economy. In fact, it's so large, we actually significantly invest overseas to diversify, because the Australian market economy could not absorb the total savings.
As you look at the scheme today, and there can now decades of experience both at the forefront of its design, and then you were minister, and now obviously you've been out of Parliament for a long period of time, still advising and working in and around pensions and superannuation. What, if you were looking at it back now, what, I suppose, as you look at it, would you maybe, as in the government, have designed differently as you look back over those years? Would there be anything that should have been, could have been, would have been different?
Two aspects. One is much earlier, I would have ensured we had a post-retirement pension annuity products in place. We're still working on that. We have what's called the retirement income covenant now, and so we're still struggling with that because you have a lump sum saving, and then when you get to your access age, which is 60 plus, depending on when you're born, you've got to make very complex decisions. So it's much easier to have set in, I think, law the parameters about what you do with that lump sum. We should have dealt with that a long time ago. So that was mistake one. I think mistake two was it's too complicated. It's a very, very complex system. There's so much individual decision making. Sure, we have default where you're on autopilot, but there are a lot of additional elements. You can put in extra contributions, you can split, there are even kiddies account. I mean, and then the added complexity in Australia is the challenge of the means test of the age pension, which again adds to complexity. So they're the two errors, I think, in retrospect, that were made.
Nick, we've just had a question come in from Kieran, and he asked, how likely is it for a Labor or for any future government to impose additional taxes on super? As you say, it's the fourth largest pension system in the world, so it's obviously an attractive pool of funds when, the government's running deficits.
Yeah, look, I mean, we've had continuous adjustments of tax parameters, caps, higher tax treatment as a consequence. I think we're at the point now where it is settled, and by the way, those tax changes have occurred under both Liberal and Labor governments. I think we're at a settled period now. You look at the level of contributions, the level of tax, the caps, you're going to have what I would term reasonable to good outcomes for individuals. So I can't, I mean, who can see the future politically, but I think those parameters are now well settled.
Nick, picking up on the theme that it's a massive pool of funds, 4.4 trillion, as you mentioned, Gordon asks, there continues to be issues around funds invested in early stage companies. How do you see the current Treasury consultation on the performance test?
That's a good question. Look, one of the greatest strengths of the Australian system is independent arm's-length trustees who make the investment decisions. That has kept the government out of direct involvement in investment decisions, and I think that's a really good thing. Unlike a lot of other countries where the government directly prescribes that particular amounts of savings should be invested in particular areas. Once you start down that track, it can be very, very dangerous in my view. The important criteria is maximising the financial return, diversified to the member, and that's a decision that should be made by the trustee. To answer the question, if any government wants to ensure additional savings from superannuation or anywhere else for that matter, other savings, into a particular sector in the economy, nothing wrong with government providing a tax treatment or tax structure to attract in capital. What I would firmly oppose was government directing that a proportion of savings, for example, should go in. With the performance test, look, it hasn't been finalised yet. I'd be surprised if there were significant changes to the performance test. There's certainly a debate. We don't know the outcome around some particular types of investment, particularly in new tech, for example. We're just going to have to wait and see. I don't expect to see significant change in the performance test. The challenge of the performance test, I think one of them is it's led to herding. Everyone's herding towards similar or the same investments.
Yeah. The questions are certainly coming in, Nick. And there's one actually regards mentioned tech, and I'll get to that. But the first question is from Joseph. Globally, no opt-in solution even vaguely met expectations. Why are most funds opposing a post-retirement opt-out?
Post-retirement is controversial. It's difficult and controversial because every individual circumstance is different. They've got a different end savings level or pool, depending on time in the system and contribution. So everyone's different. Secondly, I mentioned the complexity of the means test. All your assets and income other than the family home reduce the age pension. So it's a very, very difficult area. Generally, I favour a couple of relatively simple options. A drawdown annuity type. That means that for a period of, say, 5, 10, 15 years, you can set. And secondly, a lifetime pension where you actually buy a pension for the whole of your life. But it's predominantly at the moment it's drawdown. People do simply draw down what they need, subject to minimums, of course. The vast majority of people, I know there's an argument that some people don't draw down and leave it or intend to leave it as an estate to their kids, which is not the purpose of superannuation. But it's a very complex area, and every fund, including Team Super. By the way, I'm co-chair. I'm not the sole chair of Team Super. Every effort's being made, but it's a complex and slow process to get the solution.
Nick, we have a question from Tim who asks, to the tech adoption by super funds. Consumers are used to using sophisticated apps. Are super funds keeping up?
It varies, to be honest. With some funds, and most funds, not all, use external tech providers who are specialists in this area. I think it's fair to say that some of the tech platforms in Australia, and I have a pretty good familiarity with them, have been challenged with issues around technology usage, performance, and ultimately the trustees are legally held accountable by APRA or ASIC for any failings. It really does depend on the fund. I mean, the fund is the oversight to the contracting tech provider. A few, not many, very large funds have internal administration IT. By and large, I think we have kept up, but I do think there's an interesting discussion around having minimum technology offerings, a minimum requirement. So, all funds should have app access, for example. But by and large, I think that the individual funds have kept up. I think the big threat in this area, the big challenge is cybersecurity. And again, partly related to that, AI. These two areas are a big, big focus of funds at the present time. And I mean, indeed, the whole economy, but particularly significant implications in the superannuation.
Nick, intergenerational fairness is obviously a big issue, and we see it currently. We see it in the budget. We've obviously the federal government's moved in regards to changes to CGT negative gearing, which they put, in the category of intergenerational fairness. We know housing affordability is a big issue. Younger Australians are struggling to get into their first homes, while older Australians obviously holding, at increasing levels of wealth and assets. Is the current system striking the right balance in regards to superannuation?
But I think broadly it is, because, if you're a baby boomer like me, your level of saving in superannuation is lower that because it came in partway through the working life of baby boomers and the contributions were phased in. My daughter, and I've discussed this with my children, they are just entering the workforce. They will have a full working life of 12% minimum contribution, compulsory contribution. So their outcome will be much higher. So in that sense, superannuation is fairer. I think the big challenge with intergenerational equity, and this is true of almost every advanced and developing economy in Asia, is the decline in the birth rate.
So, Nick, look, thanks for joining us today in what was a really fascinating discussion, drawing upon, as I said, your decades of experience in this area. Really good to hear from you as, I think, one of Australia's preeminent experts in the area of superannuation.